Hi. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be recapping Wereworld Book 1 Rise of the Wolf, a 2011 book by Joblin Curtis. The story begins by introducing us to the main character Drew, a 16-year-old farm boy helping his twin brother Trent and father Mac load grain onto a wagon. Drew feels like a predator is watching the farm and advises his father not to go into town, but Mac ignores him, and he and Trent head off into town, leaving Drew on the farm with his mother Tilly Ferran. That night Drew starts to feel sick, but staring at the full moon seems to fix his illness. Drew then begins to complain to his mother about how different he and Trent are, and Tilly tells Drew that he is different, although she and Mac can't tell him why yet. At that point a wall of the farmhouse explodes as a monster breaks through the window. The monster knocked Drew aside, leaving 3 claw marks in his chest. The monster then said he had come for Tilly, proceeding to kill her. This inspired Drew to undergo a transformation, after which he managed to bite off a chunk of the monster's skull, causing it to flee. Drew quickly reverted to human form, and covered in blood he held his mother's body until his father returned. Upon returning, Mac assumes that Drew killed Tilly, and promptly stabs Drew through the stomach with a wolf's head blade, along with telling Drew he is not his son. A sword through the stomach doesn't seem to faze Drew, and Mac realizes that he forgot to use silver, and he goes to get the silver fire poker, at which point Drew runs into the dire wood. Several months later, Hogan, a master scout, and his apprentice Whitley head into the dire wood to search for an animal that's been causing trouble for the bear lord Duke Bergen. Whitley temporarily loses track of Hogan and falls off of her horse, at which point Drew walks up to her looking more like an animal than a human. As Drew reaches out to touch Whitley, Hogan returns, breaks Drew's arm and knocks him out. Hogan then sedates and ties up Drew, seemingly aware that Drew is dangerous but not sure what he is. Hogan then sets a path through the dire wood to the Dimling Road. 3 days later Drew's arm has almost totally healed, but he hasn't spoken a word to either of the scouts. Until they sit down for dinner, and Drew warns them to untie him because a group of cannibals living in the dire wood called wild ermine are going to attack. Hogan agrees to cut Drew loose on the strict condition that Drew follows all his orders. Although a wild ermine quickly shoots Hogan with a poisoned arrow, knocking him out. Drew takes the opportunity to run away, but quickly decides against it and protects Whitley from a wild ermine attack. Drew transforms in order to scare away the rest of the wild ermine, and then guides Whitley's horse, carrying her and an unconscious Hogan to the Dimling Road. Whitley and Drew do their best to treat Hogan's arrow wound, but both realize he needs serious medical attention, so Drew decides to travel through the night to reach Whitley's destination, Brackenholm, although Drew makes it clear he will return to the dire wood as soon as they reach the gate. However, before reaching the gate they are greeted by a group of Brackenholm Rangers led by a Captain Harker, who reads a note left behind by Hogan and takes Drew into custody. 3 hours later the group reaches Brackenholm, a city made up of giant trees, one of which Drew is imprisoned in. Shortly after he is imprisoned, Drew is visited by Duke Bergen, whom he questions about an altercation he could see from his cell window between the Lion Guard and a city vendor. Bergen explains that he cannot prevent the Lion Guard from abusing his citizens without invoking the wrath of King Leopold the Lion. Bergen then goes on to explain that both he and Drew are therianthropes, or shapeshifters. Bergen is a werebear, but he doesn't know which animal Drew is. As soon as Bergen relays this information, Prince Lucas arrives and takes Drew away, ignoring the protests of Bergen. During the trek to Highgarden, Lucas has one of the Rat King's Vankiscan torture Drew in order to find out what kind of warlord Drew is. However, Drew manages to stay silent until Vankiscan leaves, and Drew befriends Vankiscan's servant Hector, who was sent to heal Drew. Hector explains that he is a werebore from Redmire, and werebores are renowned for their healing abilities, so the king sent Hector to apprentice under Vankiscan, one of the 5 rat lords who rule Vermire. Later that night Duke Bergen's men attack Prince Lucas's convoy dressed as wild ermine. Drew and Hector manage to escape together and meet Bergen, who gives Drew Mac's wolf's head blade and some provisions. Bergen states that this is the most he can do, and he also informs Drew that he is the son of the previous king Werger the Wolf, making Drew a werewolf. Hector and Drew, now traveling together, set off towards Hector's homeland of Redmire. Hector explains more about how all of the lands of Lycia are ruled by different warlords, each with their own animal. Upon arriving in Redmire, Hector introduces Drew to his father Baron Huth, ruler of Redmire, and Vincent, Hector's twin brother. Baron Huth quickly agrees to hide and shelter Hector and Drew for the time being. However, Baron Huth is also housing Prince Lucas's betrothed Lady Gretchen, a werfox. Gretchen repeatedly belittles Drew for being so poorly dressed, and Drew insults her for being so arrogant. Over the next 2 weeks the Baron helps Drew and Hector find locations that they can travel to that would be outside the reach of Leopold. In addition, Drew gets some additional training with the sword from the Baron's head of guard. On the day that Drew and Hector are scheduled to leave, Vincent encourages them to stay for one more meal, during which the Lion Guard shows up to arrest Drew. Baron Huth, enraged at the intrusion and Vincent's betrayal, begins to transform into a wereboar but is killed with an illegal silver blade wielded by Captain Brutus, the leader of the Lion Guard. Drew quickly grabs Gretchen and uses her as a hostage to get Gretchen, Hector, and himself onto a boat headed down the Red Wine River. Using the boat they are able to outspeed the Lion Guard and decide to land the boat into the Bot Marshes. Drew asks about going through the Wormwood, but Hector explains the legend of Vala, a were-serpent who totally transformed into a giant serpent living in the Wormwood. Hector also retells the story of Drew's father, the previous king Werger the Wolf. Werger was a warmonger who loved going to war, but he was also well liked by the people. However, when Werger went to war with the Doglords, he left his 7 kingdoms open to attack, which Leopold exploited to capture Werger's family and force his surrender. Later that day they arrived in the Bot Marshes. Drew decided to keep Gretchen with them until they are in a populated town out of fear for her safety. The 3 of them stash the boat in the Bot Marshes and find the nearest town, where they manage to buy a room at the inn, which Gretchen immediately heads off to. Drew and Hector decide to have a meal, during which they overhear that all the conversations are about the ghost of Werger returning. One man named Ebert decides to tell the Lion Guard that they are nothing compared to the previous Wolf Guard. Before the Lion Guard can kill Ebert, Drew steps in and turns into a werewolf in order to scare the Lion Guard away. Seeing a wolf lord, the people begin to worship Drew as Werger returned, which he tries to deny, choosing to head to his room instead. Upon entering the room he finds that Gretchen has left to find her own way back to civilization. Drew gets worried that Gretchen won't make it on her own and decides to track her down along with Hector and some of the villagers. They follow her tracks until they cut off, and the villagers suggest that she has been kidnapped by Wild Ermine. The group goes to the Wild Ermine village and attacks, but Drew ends up killing the leader before he finds out what they did with Gretchen. However, Hector has a way of resurrecting the dead by creating a brimstone circle and melting some black wax on his palm. He is able to revive the shaman and force him to reveal Gretchen's location. After the leader reveals Gretchen's location, Hector attempts to end the ritual but accidentally breaks the brimstone circle, allowing the leader to attack him, which forces Drew to decapitate the leader. Because Gretchen was in the Wormwood, the villagers decided to return home and Hector and Drew continued on alone. Eventually they found an unconscious Gretchen, but upon examining her, Drew realized she had been bitten by a large snake, at which point Vala attacked. Vala briefly managed to knock Drew away, but Drew managed to turn into a werewolf and bite Vala's throat, forcing her to retreat. Drew managed to carry Gretchen out of the Wormwood, but after that the poison he ingested from biting Vala knocked him out. While Gretchen and Drew recovered from Vala's poison, Hector bought a cart and dragged them to All Hallows Bay in an attempt to get a ride on a ship. Upon arriving in All Hallows Bay, Hector strikes a deal with Captain Kane in order to get passage away from Lycia. However, Drew quickly realizes that Kane drugged them and passes out, only to wake up hours later on Kane's ship. When Drew wakes up, he is informed that Captain Kane's real name is Count Vega, a were-shark who used to own the Cluster Isles. But ever since he betrayed Werger for the promise of gold, King Leopold won't trust him, and Vega believes that by returning Drew, Hector, and Gretchen to Highcliffe he can rule the Cluster Isles once more. During the journey, Drew, Hector, and Gretchen have free rein to walk around the ship, and Drew finds out that Hector has been using the brimstone circle to communicate with his dead father. Drew asks Hector to stop using magic and Hector agrees. Later on their journey, the boat is attacked by other pirates who try to kidnap Gretchen. The crew manage to repel the attack, but Count Vega has to turn into a were-shark and chase Gretchen down before the other crew gets her. In addition, Drew jumps into the water to rescue one of Vega's younger crew members, gaining the respect of Vega, although this does not change the Count's decision to deliver Drew to Leopold. Upon arriving in Highcliffe, Drew is put in a silver-encrusted wooden yoke and whipped with a leather-studded whip as a public display. Drew is then dragged into the main courtroom, where King Leopold publicly forgives Hector for being put under Drew's spell, although he makes it clear to Hector that there will be other consequences. Leopold then decides that Drew will be executed, although Duke Bergen argues that this would break the warlord's rule to kill each other only on the battlefield. Leopold ignores this, deciding to execute Drew anyway. During this meeting, Vega also steps forward and asks to be returned to the Cluster Isles, which Leopold denies. While awaiting his execution, Drew is imprisoned in the dungeon, where Gretchen comes to visit him. During her visit, Gretchen reveals that Whitley is the daughter of Duke Bergen. She also tells Drew that the monster that killed Tilly was one of the 5 Were-Rats. Gretchen also tells Drew that he is the youngest of the 5 children that Werger had, and Drew's mother, Queen Amelie, is still alive and married to Leopold, making Prince Lucas Drew's half-brother. During the banquet on the night before Drew's execution, Bergen discusses with other warlords on how to stop Drew's execution, eventually deciding on a plan. Leopold decides to execute Drew in a public square outside of the castle walls, where a huge crowd gathers to watch. Just as Leopold brings his sword up to kill Drew, some of the Lion Guard tackle him, revealing themselves to be old Wolf Guard soldiers. Leopold quickly bats away the Wolf Guard soldier, but Duke Bergen, Count Vega, and a Werstag called Manfred step in to save Drew. Drew then announces he is the rightful son of Werger, turning the crowd against Leopold, and one of the Rat Kings urges Leopold to retreat. As Leopold retreats into his castle, Drew speaks with one of the Wolf Guards that stopped Leopold, and Drew finds out that it was Macfarron who had been informed of what actually happened by Duke Bergen. Unfortunately, Leopold hit Mac hard enough that he died as soon as Drew spoke to him. Drew then sees the portcullis of Highcliffe Castle being raised, and he decides to go after Leopold. Upon landing in Highcliffe courtyard, the Wereworld who advises retreating reveals himself to be missing half his head, where Drew had bitten it off. This Wereworld then claims Drew as his enemy, and they fight around the courtyard, during which Drew loses a finger. Realizing he is going to lose, Drew sees some barrels of oil, which he kicks the Wereworld into and sets on fire, killing the Wereworld, after which he proceeds to fall off the side of the courtyard's walls into the sea. Later, Drew wakes up on Count Vega's ship, having been rescued by the Were-Shark. Upon waking, Hector, Gretchen, Whiteley, Bergen, and Queen Amelie all begin to counsel Drew on how to become the new king, as the city chants his name.